August 1942. The mountains of Papua rise like dark green walls against the clouds. Rain falls without pause, a curtain of mist and mud that hides everything but sound. The jungle breathes. It drips, hums, and swallows whole armies. Through that living maze, a column of men crawls uphill. Bare chests glisten with sweat. Lee-Enfield rifles slung in silence. Every step sinks into black earth. These are Australians, young, exhausted, half-starved. Militiamen from suburbs and farms, suddenly fighting for the last barrier between Japan and Australia itself. Above them, unseen, Japanese troops dig in on razor ridge lines. Their uniforms soaked, their discipline absolute. They had been told the jungle would protect them, that no army could cross this wilderness. But as dawn breaks over the Owen Stanley Range, they hear something impossible: the steady crack of rifles, the muffled shouts of men advancing through the mud. The Kokoda Track has become a battlefield. A fight where distance is measured in yards, not miles. Where the jungle itself decides who lives, who dies, and who breaks first. And it all began with an assumption that the jungle would stop them. But the Australians were already coming through by mid-1942. The Pacific War had changed direction. 6 months earlier, Japan had seemed unstoppable, the rising sun flag sweeping from Hong Kong to Singapore, from the Philippines to the Dutch East Indies. The Imperial Japanese Army had taken Rabaul, the great fortress of New Britain, giving them a forward base to threaten the Australian mainland itself. For the first time, the war had crept south, across the blue waters of the Coral Sea toward Port Moresby, the last Allied outpost between Tokyo's empire and the continent of Australia, when their attempt to take Port Moresby by sea was crushed in May 1942 at the Battle of the Coral Sea. Japanese planners turned to a desperate alternative: the land. If ships could not carry them, they would march. The idea seemed straightforward on a map: land troops on Papua's northern coast, cross the island, and seize Port Moresby from the rear. What they did not grasp was the nightmare that lay between those two coasts. The Owen Stanley Range was a spine of towering jungle mountains, stretching unbroken from east to west. Peaks rose to more than 13,000 feet, shrouded in mist, carved by rivers that cut the only narrow paths through them: the Kokoda Track, a winding trail used by local villagers for generations. To cross it meant climbing vertical ridges, descending into valleys of mud, hacking through vines and roots while rain poured like ocean waves. Supply lines would have to be carried on human backs. Vehicles were impossible. Yet in July 1942, the Japanese landed at Buna on Papua's north coast. They came ashore quietly, quickly, establishing beachheads under the command of Major General Tomataro Horii. His South Seas detachment, seasoned from earlier conquests, numbered around 13,000 men. Their orders were clear: advance south along the Kokoda Track, seize the village of Kokoda with its small airstrip, then push across the mountains to Port Moresby. The operation, codenamed Operation Mo, was meant to be decisive, a strike that would isolate Australia and strengthen Japan's defensive perimeter in the Pacific. At first, their progress seemed easy. The small Australian garrison at Kokoda, elements of the 39th Militia Battalion, was thinly spread, undertrained, and poorly supplied. Many of its men had never left Australia before. They were reservists, called up to defend what seemed like a remote, secondary front. Yet they were the first line, and the only one, between the Japanese and the South Coast. In late July, the first clash came at Awala and Kokoda itself. The Australians fought fiercely but were pushed back, outnumbered and outflanked. Kokoda fell on July 29th. The Japanese now held the only usable airstrip in the region, a crucial foothold for resupply and reinforcement. For Tokyo's planners, the path ahead looked open, but the terrain had other ideas. As Horii's troops began their advance up the Owen Stanley Mountains, they discovered that the jungle did not yield. Torrential rain turned the ground into rivers of mud. Leeches clung to every exposed limb. Equipment rusted overnight. Rifles jammed. Boots disintegrated. Men carried 25 kilograms each, and still supplies ran short. To eat meant to march, to fight, to survive on half rations and stagnant water. The Australians, meanwhile, fell back toward the south, withdrawing to Diniki. Then Isurava, fighting a delaying action in terrain they barely knew. They were joined by Papuan carriers and scouts, the so-called Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels, whose local knowledge and endurance kept the Allied forces alive. Every retreat bought a few more days, a few more yards of survival. By August, both sides were learning the same lesson. In Papua, the jungle was not a battlefield. It was the war itself, and as the Japanese pushed deeper into the mountains, the Australians began to understand something vital, that holding the track, yard by yard, might decide the fate of their homeland. Far from the front line, Australia was reeling. News of Singapore's fall and the bombing of Darwin earlier in 1942 had shattered the illusion of distance. The war was no longer overseas. It was creeping toward their doorstep. For the first time in modern history, Australians faced the prospect of invasion. At the heart of the defense was the Australian Army's reorganization. Australians faced the prospect of invasion. At the heart of the defense was the Australian Army's reorganization under General Sir Thomas Blamey. With much of the experienced 2nd Australian Imperial Force still fighting in North Africa, the burden in Papua fell on the militia, part-time soldiers of the citizen military forces. They were young, under-equipped, and largely untested in jungle warfare. The 39th Battalion, barely 1,000 strong, was thrust into the path of the Japanese advance with little more than a week's notice. Their commander, Lieutenant Colonel William Owen, led from the front until he was killed at Kokoda. His successor, Major Alan Cameron, was soon replaced by Major Alan Cameron Potts, and then by other officers as casualties mounted. Leadership, like supplies, shifted constantly. The geography of the Kokoda Track dictated everything. From Ower's Corner near Port Moresby to Kokoda Village, the trail ran roughly 96 kilometers as the crow flies, but the vertical climbs and switchbacks made it feel far longer. Men often took 2 weeks to cover that ground, sometimes crawling on hands and knees. The jungle canopy blocked sunlight. Maps were unreliable, and communication between units was painfully slow. Air support was scarce, limited by the weather and the treacherous mountain winds that could smash a plane against unseen ridges. Despite this, the Australians refused to abandon the track. Reinforcements began to arrive in fragments, detachments of the 21st Brigade, veterans of Tobruk and Syria, who had been rushed home to defend the Pacific. These included the 214th, 216th, and 227th Battalions, battle-hardened, but unprepared for the suffocating green hell awaiting them. They joined forces with the battered 39th at Isurava in late August. Opposing them, Hori's troops were also facing their limits. Supply lines stretched back over mountains to Buna, through a single file of porters carrying ammunition, food, and medical supplies. For every fighting man, 3 carriers struggled behind him. Japanese command had underestimated the terrain, assuming a rapid advance. But with every step, their strength bled away, not through bullets, but through hunger, exhaustion, and disease, when the two forces met at Isurava from August 26 to 31st. 1942, the campaign reached its first great crisis. It was there that the Australians, outnumbered nearly 2 to 1, stood their ground against waves of assaults. Private Bruce Kingsbury of the 214th, armed with a Bren gun, launched a counterattack that temporarily drove the Japanese back, an act of courage that earned him a posthumous Victoria Cross. But by the end of the battle, the Australians were forced to withdraw once again, The fighting fell back from ridge to ridge, Iora Creek, Templeton's Crossing, Efogi, Iorabaiwa. Each position bought time but cost lives. The Japanese pressed relentlessly, believing Port Moresby was within reach. Yet as they advanced, their supply chain disintegrated. The promised air support never came in strength. Resupply from Buna was sporadic at best. Men resorted to half rations of rice, then to whatever the jungle provided. Malaria, dysentery, and tropical ulcers spread faster than orders could be given. In Port Moresby, Australian headquarters prepared for the worst. Defensive positions were dug around a meter ridge, the last barrier before the coastal plains. If the Japanese broke through there, Port Moresby would fall, cutting Australia's link to the United States and exposing its northern coast to invasion. Every available aircraft and unit was redirected north to hold the line. But in the hills above, something was already changing. The Japanese drive was slowing, their columns thinner, their attacks weaker. Unknown to many on the ground, the tide of war in the Pacific had begun to turn in the Coral Sea at Midway. And now in the steaming jungles of Papua, the Kokoda Track was about to shift from retreat to resistance, from endurance to counterattack. And in that transformation lay the real story of how the Australians turned the impossible terrain, once seen as their doom, into their greatest ally. For the men on the ground, the Kokoda Track was less a campaign than a test of survival. Every breath felt heavy, soaked with humidity. The air smelled of decay, of mud, sweat, and the sweet rot of vegetation. Soldiers moved not by formation but by instinct, crouching under ferns taller than a man. Sliding through gullies that swallowed sound, the Australians, many still teenagers, carried everything they owned: rifle, ammunition, rations, and the will to keep moving. Food came in tins that rusted shut. Boots fell apart. Uniforms clung like wet rags. Disease became the silent enemy. Malaria and dysentery struck without warning, reducing whole sections to walking skeletons. Yet somehow, men who could barely stand still fought. They learned to use the jungle, to vanish when the enemy was near, to attack from angles unseen, to fire once and fade into the green. For the Japanese, the experience was no easier. Many had fought in China or Malaya, but nothing compared to this. They too endured starvation, mud, and the endless climb. Officers pushed their men forward with a grim fatalism. To halt was to die anyway. In the darkness of the jungle, both armies began to resemble each other, gaunt, fevered shadows driven by orders and instinct. Amid this misery, the local Papuan carriers became lifelines. They carried stretchers through terrain that would break most men, often barefoot, guiding the wounded toward aid posts far to the rear. Australian soldiers came to call them the Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels, not out of condescension, but awe. They moved silently, faithfully through the rain and gunfire, their faces calm as they bore the weight of men who could no longer walk. In these mountains, victory wasn't measured in territory, but in endurance. The human ability to take one more step when logic said there was none left to give. The jungle rewrote every military rule. Formations dissolved. Maps lost meaning. Radios failed in the canopy's damp embrace. Visibility shrank to 10 yards, sometimes less. Battles became sudden explosions of chaos, bursts of fire, screams, then silence. The Australians adapted quickly. Commanders abandoned traditional lines of advance and learned to fight in small groups. Patrols that moved independently, communicating by whistle or the crack of a rifle. Ambushes replaced frontal assaults. A handful of men could hold a ridge for hours against hundreds, using terrain as both shield and trap. The Japanese, disciplined and aggressive, preferred direct attacks, but in the jungle that advantage often became a weakness. They charged into killing zones they couldn't see, against an enemy they couldn't pinpoint. Both sides used the environment as weapon and cover. Machine guns were set to fire down narrow paths. Mortar were aimed not by sight, but by the sound of movement. Fighting sometimes continued for days without either side fully realizing how close they were. At Isurava, men fought at such short distances that grenades bounced back off trees, yet tactics were shaped not only by the terrain, but by exhaustion. Orders took hours to reach forward elements. Ammunition ran out mid-battle. When communications broke, initiative decided survival. Patrol leaders became kings of their small domains, making choices that determined whether a dozen men lived or vanished. This was a war stripped to its essentials: man, weapon, and will, fought not across miles, but meters. In Papua, logistics were destiny. Every bullet, every biscuit, every bandage had to be carried by hand. Trucks and jeeps were useless. The jungle devoured machinery. Airdrops became lifelines, but pilots faced storm clouds that shredded aircraft and winds that hurled supplies into ravines. Many crates smashed on impact or drifted into enemy hands. For the Japanese, the problem was even worse. Their entire supply line stretched back to the beaches at Buna and Gona, over mountains that offered no roads and little rest. Pack animals died within days. Porters collapsed under the weight of ammunition. The further they advanced, the hungrier they became. Men boiled strips of leather from their boots or chewed on roots to stave off hunger. The Australians fared slightly better as Allied air control improved. The Kokoda transport planes began dropping supplies more accurately, and local Papuan carriers formed a network of resupply that could snake through the jungle faster than any truck. Makeshift medical stations appeared along the track, tents of canvas and bamboo, buzzing with flies where doctors worked knee-deep in mud. Technology, in the modern sense, was almost meaningless here. Tanks, heavy artillery, even vehicles, all rendered useless by the mountains. What mattered was adaptability, the rifle that still fired after a week of rain, the waterproof match, the discipline to travel light and move silently. The Kokoda Campaign became proof that logistics, not numbers or firepower, decide wars in places where nature refuses to cooperate. And as both armies strained under the impossible weight of the jungle, leadership itself began to take a new form, one that would define what came next. Command in the jungle was unlike anything the generals had known before. Maps meant little. Reports arrived hours, sometimes days, after events had unfolded. Commanders could not see the battlefield. They could only imagine it. Orders were written in tents lit by hurricane lamps, then carried through miles of rain and fog by runners who might never return. For the Australians, Brigadier Arnold Potts became the central figure of this phase. A veteran of the First World War, Potts understood courage but was learning the cost of command in a war defined by exhaustion. His 21st Brigade inherited a retreating front, scattered units, and dwindling supplies. Yet he insisted that every ridge, every knoll, be contested, not to hold ground permanently, but to delay, to bleed the enemy of time and strength. His mantra was simple: trade space for survival. Potts faced pressure from above. In Port Moresby, General Blamey demanded results and accused his militia of lacking determination. In truth, those men had fought in conditions Blamey could scarcely imagine. The tension between headquarters and front line became a quiet struggle of its own, between theory and reality, between orders typed in comfort and decisions made in mud. On the Japanese side, Major General Tamataro Hori led with equal resolve. He was a disciplined officer, respectful of his men, and determined to achieve his objective. But as weeks passed, Hori's confidence met the limits of human endurance. His reports grew more urgent, his tone more weary. He knew his troops were starving, that the jungle was claiming more soldiers than bullets ever could. Yet withdrawal was unthinkable under the weight of imperial doctrine. Only when starvation and sickness threatened annihilation did he finally pull back, a decision that would define his legacy as both necessary and tragic. Leadership in Kokoda was measured not in victories, but in how long a man could bear the burden of command when every choice led to loss. To the Japanese, the Kokoda advance was meant to be another swift strike, another triumph like those in Malaya or the Philippines. Their military culture prized aggression and endurance. Officers drilled their men to move relentlessly, to accept hardship without complaint. The jungle, they believed, would favor their discipline and surprise. Initially it did. Their soldiers were experts at infiltration, moving silently at night, flanking by instinct. They respected the Australians as opponents, but expected them to break under pressure. They had faced British and American forces before. They assumed these young colonials, with little experience, would crumble quickly. But the Australians did not. Instead, they learned, adapted, and began to fight as shadows within the jungle itself. For the Japanese, this was disorienting. Their maps proved inaccurate. Supply convoys vanished. Units advanced into terrain they couldn't navigate. Their strength, rigid discipline, and obedience became a liability when the situation demanded flexibility. Cultural expectations deepened the hardship. Japanese soldiers were forbidden to surrender. Wounded men were left behind with grenades to take their own lives, or the enemy with them. This mindset created an atmosphere of relentless determination, but also of despair. When the order to withdraw came, many viewed it as unthinkable dishonor. Horii himself drowned during the retreat down the Kumusi River, trying to lead what was left of his men back to the coast. The Japanese did not lose Kokoda for lack of bravery. They lost it because courage could not feed them, and pride could not conquer the jungle. Kokoda was never meant to be decisive in global terms. It was a small track in an obscure corner of the Pacific. But for both nations, it carried moral weight far beyond its geography. For Australia, it was proof that they could fight alone, that their sons could hold the line without British command, without American dominance. The militia, once dismissed as second-rate, had become the shield of the continent. For Japan, the campaign revealed the limits of expansion. It marked the point where ambition collided with geography, where technological prowess and aggressive doctrine were humbled by the realities of terrain and distance. The jungle, indifferent and eternal, stripped every army to its basics: endurance, supply, leadership. There was also a moral reckoning. In the suffering of Kokoda, both sides displayed courage that transcended ideology. The Papuans, who carried the wounded and shared their food, became symbols of compassion amid cruelty. Even captured soldiers sometimes found unexpected mercy from their enemies, fleeting moments of humanity in a war that otherwise consumed it. Strategically, Kokoda forced Japan onto the defensive. It ensured Port Moresby remained allied, allowing the buildup for later offensives in Buna, Gona, and Sanananda. It was a small victory with vast consequences, reshaping the course of the Pacific War. By late September 1942, both armies were locked in exhaustion, one at the end of its reach, the other at the edge of its endurance. What came next would determine who held the initiative in the South Pacific. The turning point was near. By mid-September 1942, the war along the Kokoda Track had reached its breaking point. The Japanese were within 30 kilometers of Port Moresby. From their forward positions on Isurava Ridge, they could see, faint through the mist, the faint outline of the Coral Sea. It was the closest they would ever come. Major General Hori's men had marched for 2 months, through the mountains, fighting, starving, and dying in silence. Behind them stretched a shattered supply line. Their uniforms were rags. Many had not eaten a full meal in days. Some carried wounded comrades on bamboo poles. Hori still believed victory might be within reach. One more push, one more ridge, and Moresby could fall. But reality had already shifted beyond his control. At the same time, the Australians under Brigadier Potts were preparing their final stand at Amita Ridge, the last defensive line before the plains. Artillery was positioned along the slopes. Machine guns covered the narrow approaches. Behind them, engineers cut fallback paths to Moresby. Every soldier knew there would be no further retreat. If the Japanese broke through here, there was nothing left but open ground. The stage was set for a decisive confrontation, but it never came. The jungle, exhaustion, and starvation conspired to halt the Japanese before the guns could. On September 16th, Hari received an order from his superiors in Rabaul: withdraw. The reason was larger than he knew. The Allied victory at Guadalcanal had forced Japan to divert aircraft and supplies northward. Without support, Hori's detachment was stranded. What had begun as a bold advance now turned into a desperate fight for survival. When the Australians realized the Japanese were no longer pressing, disbelief replaced fear. Reconnaissance patrols pushed cautiously forward, finding abandoned positions, rifles rusting in the mud, bodies left unburied. By late September, the Australians began to advance, not in triumph, but in disbelief that the tide had turned. Potts himself had been replaced by Brigadier Porter under Blamey's orders. The change caused resentment among the troops. They believed Potts had done all any man could. Still, the advance continued. The 25th Brigade now took the lead, followed by the veterans of the 16th. Their mission was to pursue the withdrawing Japanese and retake Kokoda. But every step forward was paid for with the same exhaustion the enemy had endured. Rain returned in torrents. Supply drops missed their marks. Men sank waist-deep in mud that smelled of decay. Progress came not through strength, but sheer stubbornness. For the Japanese, retreat became nightmare. They moved through the same ridges they had conquered, but now in reverse, weaker, hungrier, haunted by the ghosts of their own fallen. Hori's once disciplined columns fragmented. Some units fought rearguard actions at Templeton's Crossing and Eora Creek, buying time for the wounded to escape. Others melted into the jungle, too sick to continue. Hori ordered what remained of his force to fall back to the coast at Buna. He tried to lead by example, marching with his staff until they reached the swollen Kumusi River. There, in November 1942, his raft capsized in floodwaters. He drowned, a general dying the same way as countless soldiers before him, swallowed by the jungle he had tried to conquer. Meanwhile, the Australians pressed on, unaware of his fate. By early November, they reached the village of Kokoda. The airstrip, once in Japanese hands, lay silent under tropical rain. The flag of Australia rose again over the clearing, witnessed by exhausted men who had fought continuously for 4 months. They had retaken what was lost, but ahead, the coastal strongholds of Buna, Gona, and Sanananda waited, heavily fortified and supplied by sea, for the moment, though Kokoda marked the turning point. The momentum of the Pacific Ground War had shifted, not by a single grand battle, but through attrition, endurance, and human will. The Japanese had believed the jungle impassable to their enemy. Now it was their own undoing. As word spread through Port Moresby and beyond, Australians realized that something historic had happened. They had not merely survived. They had forced one of the most formidable armies in the world to retreat. The myth of Japanese invincibility had been broken here, on a muddy mountain trail few outside Papua had ever heard of. But the campaign was not yet over. The Japanese still held the coast. The Australians, bloodied but unbroken, would now have to descend into the swamps and beaches to finish what the jungle had begun. The struggle was about to change shape from mountain to coast. From retreat to assault. The retaking of Kokoda in early November 1942 marked the symbolic reversal of fortune, but for those who fought, it was only the midpoint of the ordeal. Ahead lay the coastal strongholds of Buna, Gona, and Sanananda, the final bastions of the Japanese presence in Papua. These were not jungle trails but swamps, mangroves and sand fortified with bunkers, trenches, and concealed firing points. The Japanese, now cornered, were ordered to hold these positions to the last man. For the Australians and their American allies, the task ahead was as brutal as any in the Pacific. The mountains had tested endurance. The coast would test survival itself. Supply remained a constant torment. Planes dropped crates that vanished into the jungle or sank into mud. Rations came spoiled or soaked through. Men advanced in knee-deep water, their skin eaten raw by tropical ulcers. Each village had to be taken by hand, each bunker destroyed at point-blank range. Brigadier George Vassy, who now commanded the 7th Division, described it bitterly in a letter home. "It is not war as men imagine it. There is no gallantry here. Only filth, sweat, and death in a green swamp." At Gona, the first clashes began in mid-November. The Japanese had constructed low, interlocking bunkers made from coconut logs and sand, invisible until they opened fire. Every approach was covered by crossfire. Mortar failed to dislodge them. Artillery sank into the bog before it could be positioned. The fighting devolved into savage close combat. Bayonets, grenades, and flamethrowers became the only tools that worked. By early December, Gona fell, but at a cost that horrified even the victors. Hundreds of Australians lay dead for a few hundred meters of ground. To the east, the Americans of the 32nd Division, untested and poorly acclimatized, attacked Buna. They were brave but ill-prepared. Many wore summer uniforms, still believing the tropics to be beach weather. Within days, malaria, dysentery, and exhaustion reduced entire companies to skeleton crews. The Japanese, entrenched in coconut groves and swamp ditches, repelled assault after assault. Australian units were sent to reinforce them, and for the first time, the two forces fought side by side under Australian command. Cooperation was uneasy at first, the Americans frustrated by conditions. The Australians hardened by months of jungle warfare, but necessity forced unity. The battle dragged through December, a month of relentless rain and horror. Bodies could not be buried. They swelled in the heat, covered by flies. The stench clung to the living. Bullets came from unseen bunkers. Every coconut palm might hide a sniper. In such terrain, progress was measured not in miles but in meters, and in men. At Sanananda, the last Japanese bastion, resistance became fanatical. Cut off from supply, they fought until ammunition ran out, then with bayonets and knives. Many refused surrender, even when surrounded. Some soldiers were found dead, still clutching grenades beneath their chests. By mid-January 1943, the final positions fell silent. What remained of Hori's South Seas Detachment had been annihilated. Of the 13,000 who had begun the campaign in July, barely 1,300 survived. The Australian losses were also severe, over 2,100 killed, 4,000 wounded, and thousands more sick. The price of victory was almost indistinguishable from defeat, but strategically it was decisive. For the first time in the Pacific War, Japanese land forces had been forced into full retreat. From this point onward, Japan would fight defensively. The Kokoda and Buna and Gona campaigns had broken their advance and exposed the limits of their reach. For the Australians, the psychological shift was profound. The soldiers who returned to Port Moresby in early 1943 were not the same men who had marched out in July. They were thinner, older in spirit, and marked forever by what they had seen. Yet among them ran a quiet pride, not the triumph of conquest, but the endurance of survival. They had held when the world believed they would fall. Back home, news of the victory spread slowly, filtered through military censors. But when Prime Minister John Curtin finally announced that the Japanese thrust toward Australia had been repelled, it was received as more than a military success, it was a deliverance. In Melbourne, Sydney, and Perth, church bells rang. Families who had feared invasion could breathe again. The Kokoda Track had become a national symbol almost overnight of courage, sacrifice, and the peculiar kind of heroism born not from victory, but from endurance. The men who fought there would never forget the smell of the jungle, the endless rain, or the mates left behind in the mud. For them, the war would always return to those narrow mountain paths. The whisper of leeches in the dark, the sound of boots slipping on wet roots. The campaign's climax was not a single moment of triumph, but the slow, painful realization that they had endured what no army should have had to. From Kokoda to Buna, the story was not of conquest, but of persistence. The refusal to yield when everything demanded surrender. By February 1943, the guns had fallen silent across the Papuan coast. The jungle, once alive with fire and movement, had reclaimed the battlefield. Palm trees sprouted through shattered bunkers. Rusted helmets disappeared beneath vines. Only the graves, rows of simple wooden crosses, testified to what had happened there. For the Allies, Kokoda and the battles of Buna and Gona marked the first true land victory against Japan in the Pacific War. It was a turning point that shifted both morale and momentum. The Japanese army, once considered invincible in jungle warfare, had been forced to withdraw for the first time. They had discovered, painfully, that determination alone could not overcome the limits of supply, terrain, and endurance. In Tokyo, the Imperial General Headquarters downplayed the defeat. Newspapers referred to the withdrawal as a strategic realignment. But within Japan's military circles, the truth was known. The South Seas Detachment had been destroyed, and with it, the last chance of threatening Australia directly. The hope of isolating Australia from American support, the grand vision of the Southern Offensive, had vanished in the mud of Papua. The Australian government, however, did not celebrate with parades. The victory had come at too high a cost. Reports from the front described the appalling conditions, the medical crises, the state of near starvation endured by the troops. Over 600 Australians were killed in the Kokoda Track Campaign alone, but nearly 3 times that number had to be evacuated for disease. Malaria, dysentery, and tropical ulcers had done as much damage as enemy bullets. Medical officers who examined returning units described men reduced to physical shadows, weighing barely 45 kilograms. Their uniforms hanging loose, their skin ulcerated. They carried not just the scars of battle, but the burden of trauma. For months afterward, soldiers woke in sweat-soaked beds, hearing again the rain, the cries, the rustle of unseen footsteps in the dark. Yet amidst the exhaustion and grief, the legend of Kokoda began to take shape. It was not created by propaganda, but by the soldiers themselves, and by the quiet reverence of those who met them when they returned. Towns raised money for memorials. Schools taught the names of villages like Isurava, Iora Creek, and Oivigorari. These were not grand battlefields, but places that symbolized something deeper. The moment a small army defended its homeland with nothing but courage. Mateship and endurance. In the United States, Allied commanders studied the campaign closely. General Douglas MacArthur called it one of the bravest and most skillfully conducted operations in military history. But he also noted its lessons, the necessity of air supply, the perils of underestimating terrain, and the need for cooperation between forces, unaccustomed to each other's methods. MacArthur's headquarters used the victory as a foundation for the next phase, the offensive. Across New Guinea and into the Solomon Islands. From the jungles of Papua, the Allied advance would push northward toward Lihue, Salamaua, and eventually the Philippines. The long road to Japan would begin here, in the mud, the mountains, and the silence of Kokoda. For Japan, the loss forced a shift in strategy. No longer able to expand, they entrenched themselves along the island chains, building defensive rings that would bleed the Allies for years to come. The jungle, once considered their natural ally, had turned against them. It had favored those who adapted, who learned to live and fight within its chaos. And the Australians' untrained militiamen turned battle-hardened veterans had done just that. They had not just survived the jungle, they had mastered it, but the physical victory did not erase the human cost. Families across Australia received telegrams marked, "Regret to inform you." Soldiers who returned alive often avoided talking about the campaign. Some refused to ever see the mountains again. Others carried the memory until death. Still, in the silence that followed, one truth emerged clearly. The Japanese belief that the jungle would stop the enemy had failed, because the Australians hadn't stopped. They had crawled, climbed, bled, and endured until the impossible was done. And from that endurance, the legend of Kokoda was born, not as myth, but as memory. The jungle would never forget them. When the campaign ended, the Australian government began to piece together what had truly happened along that narrow trail between Kokoda and Buna. Military photographers and war correspondents arrived months too late by then. Most traces of battle had already been reclaimed by nature. What they found was haunting. Bunkers half swallowed by roots, helmets filled with rainwater, and paths worn smooth by the boots of men who never came back. It was there, in that silence, that the meaning of Kokoda began to crystallize. It was no grand victory in the traditional sense, no massive armored breakthrough, no triumphal parade through enemy territory. Instead, it was the story of holding on, of men pushed to the edge of what a human body could endure, and refusing to give ground. Historians later described Kokoda as Australia's Thermopylae, but those who fought there knew it was something different. There was no choice of glory, no heroic stand for its own sake. It was necessity, the defense of home, fought in the mud by men who had been told they would never amount to soldiers. In the years that followed, the veterans returned to ordinary lives. Some became farmers again, others teachers, clerks, and fathers. For decades, few spoke of what they had seen. The memories were too raw, too full of ghosts. Only in later years did the nation begin to honor them fully, to recognize that the defense of Australia had not been fought on its shores, but on a jungle track hundreds of miles away. Meanwhile, the track itself, overgrown, steep, and unforgiving, became sacred ground. Pilgrims began walking it in the 1970s, tracing the footsteps of those who had fought there. They carried small flags, wore the names of fallen relatives on their sleeves, and crossed the same rivers, the same ridges. Many broke down halfway, from exhaustion, emotion, or both. The jungle remained as it had been in 1942, wet, heavy, eternal. The Papua New Guinean carriers, once dismissed in wartime reports as mere auxiliaries, were finally recognized for what they were: indispensable. Their role had been monumental. Without them, the Australian force would have perished in the mountains. The Australian soldiers had called them the Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels, a phrase born from gratitude rather than condescension. In the decades after, monuments were raised in their honor, not as symbols, but as brothers in arms who shared the suffering and saved countless lives. The Kokoda Campaign also reshaped Australia's identity. For the first time, Australians fought a battle that was their own, not under British command, not as part of imperial ventures, but for the defense of their continent. It marked a psychological shift from dependency to self-reliance. The legend of Gallipoli had defined sacrifice. Kokoda would define endurance. For Japan, the loss in Papua was part of a broader unraveling. The empire's expansion halted. Their armies began to retreat across the Pacific. But even in defeat, Japanese veterans remembered the Australians with respect. Many later wrote that the enemy had fought with the ferocity of men defending their homes. It was a rare, quiet acknowledgement, soldier to soldier, that courage had existed on both sides of the jungle. In 1943, as the war's tide turned toward the Allies, few outside Australia fully understood what had been accomplished on that narrow trail. It would take historians decades to piece it together, to realize that the victory at Kokoda had changed not only the course of the Pacific War, But the character of a nation. The mountains still stand as they did in 1942. The rain still falls. The track remains, a thin scar across the heart of Papua New Guinea. Each year, new footsteps echo there. Some walk for remembrance, some to test their limits, and some to understand what it meant for ordinary men to fight an impossible war in a world that had already forgotten them. Because long after the gunfire faded, the story of Kokoda did not end. It simply grew quieter, carried by the wind, whispered through the trees, and remembered by those who still walked that path. And from that silence emerges the final truth. The jungle never stopped them. It tested them, consumed them, and revealed what endurance truly meant. The Kokoda Track was more than a battle. It was a confrontation between human frailty and the raw force of nature, between will and wilderness. It asked questions no soldier could answer until the moment he was tested. How far can a man go when there is no road, no rations, and no retreat? The Australians who fought there did not win because they were stronger or better trained. They won because they endured. Their weapons rusted, their boots fell apart, but their determination, born of fear, loyalty, and love of home, never broke. In the jungle's endless rain, they discovered something deeper than courage. They found resilience. For the Japanese, the campaign was a lesson in hubris, the realization that even the fiercest discipline cannot conquer a landscape that refuses to yield. For the Australians, it was a revelation of identity. Kokoda was not fought for empire, but for survival, for the right of a young nation to stand on its own. Decades later, when the veterans grew old and the jungle reclaimed their battlefield, the meaning of Kokoda only deepened. It became a symbol not of glory, but of endurance, a reminder that history's most defining victories are often the quietest ones. On the trail today, the forest hums with the same sounds as in 1942, cicadas, rain, and the distant rush of mountain rivers. Travelers stop at rusting helmets and weathered crosses, and they understand, even for a moment, what those men carried. The story of Kokoda endures because it is, at its core, the story of what happens when ordinary people are asked to do impossible things, and do them anyway. The Japanese believed the jungle would stop their enemy, but the Australians came crawling through it, starving, barefoot, half dead, and proved that no wall of rain mud or fear could stop a people fighting for home. And when the last echoes of battle faded into the green silence, the mountains kept their secret. A secret whispered still through the mist, that sometimes survival itself is victory.